In 1928, New York Governor Al Smith became the country's first Irish Catholic presidential nominee, serving as the Democratic candidate. He lost in a landslide to Herbert Hoover due in no small part to his Catholicism. For centuries beforehand, Americans had been bombarded with anti-Catholic propaganda, partially steeped in suspicion of the hierarchical nature of the Catholic Church, and partially in Americans' general hatred for the Irish. Cities experienced major anti-Catholic riots, with churches being burned down, and entire successful political parties were started on the basis of blocking Catholicism's spread. In 2021, Joe Biden became the United States' second Catholic president, after John F. Kennedy in 1961. But his Catholicism wasn't even really that much of an issue, and nearly half of American Catholics voted against him, whereas 70 to 83% of American Catholics supported Kennedy. So how did we go from burning Catholic parishes to a candidate's being Irish or Catholic being basically not an issue?
Why, Tammany would surely fall. There'd really be no hall at all if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews.
To say the first English settlers in the New World weren't tolerant of Catholics would be an understatement, to say the least. One of the most popular books amongst the settlers was John Fox's Book of Martyrs, which detailed the brutal execution of 3 Protestants by Catholic Queen Mary I. In the book, Fox certainly wasn't shy about his feelings about Catholics. Turn to every land where popery predominates, and you will find an ignorant and debased peasantry, a profligate nobility, and a priesthood licentious, avaricious, domineering, and cruel. The work paints Catholics as bloodthirsty zealots obsessed with power who converted others through force, which the English Protestants, of course, never were or did. The Puritan founders of New England were famously supportive of Oliver Cromwell, the fanatically anti-Catholic leader of England following the English Revolution. Just as their idol had done in England, Puritan New Englanders banned Christmas for decades due to it being too Catholic. For preventing disorders arising in several places within this jurisdiction, by reason of some still observing such festivals as were superstitiously kept in other countries, to the great dishonor of God and offense of others, it is therefore ordered by this court and the authority thereof, that whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, upon such accountants as aforesaid, every person so offended shall pay of every such offense 5 shillings as a fine to the county. The holiday would be banned colony-wide from 1659 to 1681. Aside from waging a legal war on Christmas, the colony made its anti-Catholic sentiments well known through other means. Just 3 years after coming to the continent, Puritans in Plymouth celebrated their first Pope Night on November 5th, 1623. The celebration involved a bonfire whose flame apparently jumped to some nearby houses, destroying them. Just as those flames had spread to those Puritans' homes, Pope Night rapidly spread through New England. Festivities occurred up and down the colony's coast for centuries. Boston's version of Pope Night was a major spectacle, with 2 different parades from rival groups in the northern and southern sides of the city, featuring effigies of the Pope, Satan, and unpopular political figures. The festivities culminated in a major brawl between the 2 groups of paraders, which occasionally turned brutal. In those battles, stones, brickbats, besides clubs, were freely used, and although persons were seldom killed, yet broken heads were not infrequent. The winning side then took the losing side's money and floats and burned their effigies. The winning side would then use their stolen money to buy a large feast. How heartwarming. Aside from being filled with anti-Catholic rhetoric, Pope Night was also a time for anti-authority protests. On Pope Night 1765, celebrants rioted against the Stamp Act and burned down the house of Colonial Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson. The tradition would continue until the Revolutionary War, when George Washington, in his attempt to gain the support of the Catholic French, put an end to the Pope Night in 1775. It then promptly returned for 1776 and 1777, with it finally coming to an end in Boston following the French entrance into the war on the American side. Within English North America, however, there was one colony where Catholics were supposedly free to do as they wish: Maryland. The Catholic Cecilius Calvert, Lord Baltimore, was given the land that makes up modern-day Maryland in 1632. Though the Catholics were eventually swept out of power by a Protestant majority and Catholics were later barred from holding public office in the state, Catholic Marylanders would still play an important role in American life. When the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, only one signatory would be a Catholic, Marylander Charles Carroll. That didn't mean the other founding fathers were very tolerant of Catholics, though. After attending a Catholic service in Philadelphia, John Adams remarked to his wife in a letter, "Here is everything which can lay hold of the eye, ear, and imagination, everything which can charm and bewitch the simple and ignorant. I wonder how Luther ever broke the spell." Non-Catholics would charge the Catholic Church with being too aristocratic and illiberal, and to a certain extent, yeah, kinda, it's never really been a democratic institution. This is what Pope Pius VI had to say about the Enlightenment ideals that brought about the American Revolution. "Everyone must understand that such ravings and others like them, concealed in many deceitful guises, cause greater ruin to public calm than the longer their imperious originators are unrestrained. They cause a serious loss of souls redeemed by Christ's blood, whenever their teaching spreads like a cancer." On the other hand, his successor, Pius VII, was a lot more open to democracy. "The form of a democratic government adopted among you, dearly beloved, in no way contradicts the maxims I have previously stated, nor is it repugnant to the gospel. It demands all the sublime virtues that are learned only at the school of Jesus Christ, and that practiced religiously among you will make for your happiness and contribute to the glory and renown of our republic. Yes, my dear sisters and brothers, be good Christians, and you will be excellent Democrats." Immediately after the Revolution, American Protestants really cranked it down a notch when it came to anti-Catholicism. Instead of burning the Pope in effigy, they largely adopted a live-and-let-live principle when it came to religion. However, things began to shift as immigration increased during the Industrial Revolution. More Irish and German immigrants began coming to America, and many of them were Catholic. Unlike earlier newcomers, these new Irish immigrants were often poor, low-skilled workers who were in direct competition with local Protestant workers.
"I don't see no Americans. I see trespassers. Irish hops will do a job for a nickel what a does for a dime, and a white man used to get a quarter for."
This new immigration and competition gave rise to a new American political movement, Nativism. The term Nativism was derived from the name of the Native American Party. Not defenders of indigenous rights by any means, nativists favored policies like a 21-year-long path to citizenship and blocking Catholics from holding public office. One of the most prominent anti-Catholic groups was the American Protestant Association, which believed that Catholics were being deliberately sent to America by the Pope to replace the Protestant population in a sort of great replacement, if you will. They believed, as Mary Jane Farrelly put it in her book on American Anti-Catholicism, immigrants were ill-equipped to handle the responsibilities of American citizenship, that their habits and values were different from and inferior to those of native-born Americans, and that they would, through the power of their sheer numbers, alter, corrupt, and eventually destroy America's unique and highly advanced civilization. German Protestants and even Mormons, whose church was born in upstate New York, making it probably more native than any religion that the nativists followed, were deemed objectionable by the group. At the peak of their power in 1854, they held 52 seats in the House of Representatives and controlled multiple state governments. 2 years later, they nominated former President Millard Fillmore as their presidential candidate and received 21.5% of the popular vote. At the same time, bloody anti-Catholic riots erupted in multiple cities, most notably in Baltimore and Louisville. And while this occurred across the country, nowhere else were the tensions between Catholic immigrants and Protestant natives stronger than in New York City. Between 1830 and 1845, the population of Catholics in New York more than doubled from 35,000 to 80,000.
And they got a right warm welcome.
Go back to Ireland, you dumb mitt!
You remember that, you frog Irish?
Get back in the food, Patty!
In 1844, nativist James Harper, whose company published that awful disclosures book from earlier, ran for mayor of the city as a candidate of the American Republican Party, whose platform wasn't exactly immigrant-friendly, to say the least. There is, again, a large portion of these aliens and adopted citizens who, seeking alone their selfish interests and caring little or nothing for the purity and permanency of our institutions. They are insensible to peaceful and reasonable influences and measures, and their wanton and blind spots therefore necessarily require stringent and forcible means to counteract them and to arrest their fatal effects. Should one rob himself, his family, and friends of all that he and they love, and which is the source of all their happiness, to bestow it upon those who neither need or appreciate it? Harper won the 1844 mayoral election by dog whistling about municipal reform. His primary target was Tammany Hall, the infamously corrupt Democratic political machine whose bosses and henchmen orchestrated mass graft and theft. You may know about them from your history teacher talking about Boss Tweed or Richard Croker, two of the machine's most infamous leaders.
Monk's already won by 3,000 more votes than there are voters.
Only 3 make it 20, 30. We don't need a victory, we need a Roman triumph.
But we don't have any more ballots.
Remember the first rule of politics. The ballots don't make the results. The counters make the results. The counters keep counting.
But what you probably didn't know is that A, the reformers were often as corrupt as the machines they fought, and B, Tammany provided a lot of jobs and services to the communities they served, which were often poor, immigrant Catholic, and Jewish neighborhoods. Tammany would seek immigrant votes and then upon entering office would disperse jobs to their supporters. These jobs included anything from street sweepers to remove manure from the city's clogged cobblestones to police officers and even judges. These were desirable jobs, too, because they offered immigrants an escape from the undependable construction jobs they were relegated to. These were called patronage jobs and were a major target of reformers for decades. In addition to jobs, Tammany would also provide poor immigrants with a variety of services that they otherwise couldn't afford. They would give residents coal for their furnaces, food for their children, and would even help them find a place to sleep. During the Civil War, Tammany even organized a massive effort to pay for substitutes for New Yorkers who got drafted. As Tammany ward boss Louis Eisenstein would later put it, who else would have offered aid? Certainly not the stiff, aloof Republicans, while the Socialists were too busy preparing for the brave new world of the future to bother with the immediate needs of the present. In 1877, the New York legislature attempted to pass an amendment to the state's constitution that would block anyone who didn't own property worth $500 or more or pay rent worth $250 or more from voting. One estimate later found that this measure would have disenfranchised half of New York City's voters. The amendment's supporters included the very same reformers that opposed Tammany and even future President Theodore Roosevelt. In that fall's election, Tammany was able to conjure up enough support to block the amendment's final passage. Tammany and the reformers would continue to jockey for power for decades, with the largely immigrant Tammany going up against the largely white Anglo-Saxon Protestant reformers. In the early 1900s, ward boss and Irishman Charles Francis Murphy became the head of Tammany and made it a force to be reckoned with. Over the next 20 years, Tammany would lead the way in establishing some of the nation's first workers' compensation and minimum wage laws, better worker safety regulations, and college scholarships for poor kids. Things that were basically unheard of in America's generally laissez-faire economy. Another key figure in all of this was Al Smith, an Irish Catholic who had grown up
On the sidewalks of New York.
a grade school dropout who had worked as a child to support his single mother. Smith worked his way through Tammany leadership to eventually end up as the New York State Assembly's majority leader. In 1918, he was elected as America's first Irish Catholic governor, breaking a religious and ethnic barrier that had existed for decades. A decade later, he broke another barrier. In 1928, he was nominated by the Democratic Party to the presidency, becoming the first Irish Catholic to do so. Though he lost in a landslide, he would set a precedent that Irish Catholics weren't restricted to state and local politics. All the while this is happening, however, another force is growing in deep opposition to Irish Catholics and immigrants in general: the Klan. The first iteration of the Klan, which had popped up immediately after the Civil War, died out in 1871. In 1915, however, the organization was reignited by the release of D.W. Griffith's landmark film, Birth of a Nation, which portrayed Klansmen as courageous protectors of the white race. Aside from being just as racist as the Klan 1.0, Klan 2.0 was also virulently anti-Catholic. The Klan was pro-prohibition, which the German and Irish Catholics decidedly were not, and blamed them for bringing sin and vice to America. Following Al Smith's crushing defeat in 1928, the Great Depression started and the American people began to really sour on the Republican Party, which had been in power for a decade. In 1932, another New York governor and close enemy turned friend to Al Smith, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected president in a landslide. Catholics would form a major base for FDR throughout his presidency and for the Democrats for the next 30 years as a part of what would be referred to as the New Deal coalition. In 1936, for example, estimates for the percentage of Catholics who voted for FDR ranged from 70 to 81%. In 1960, the Democratic Party nominated Massachusetts Irish Catholic Senator John F. Kennedy to the presidency. Just like with Al Smith 30 years prior, Kennedy's faith was oftentimes a sticking point with those who were against the idea of a Catholic president. In September 1960, Kennedy gave a speech to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, a Protestant organization, explaining why his Catholicism wouldn't keep him from leading the country effectively.
I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source. But let me stress again that these are my views. For contrary to common newspaper usage, I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic.
In November of that year, Kennedy won by the slimmest of margins, beating out his Republican opponent Richard Nixon by just over 100,000 votes. Oddly enough, Nixon would become the first Republican presidential candidate to win a majority of the Catholic vote just 12 years later. In 1962, the House of Representatives elected its first Catholic speaker, Massachusetts Democratic Representative John William McCormack. In the 1970s, 2 Catholic priests were even elected to the House, Father Robert Drinan of Massachusetts and Father Robert John Cornell of Wisconsin. However, they were forced to leave office after Pope John Paul II declared that clergy shouldn't get involved in electoral politics. Today, Catholics are just another part of American society. Instead of die-hard allegiance to a specific political party, Catholics are split generally down the middle. The heads of all 3 branches of the American government are now Catholics, with Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Patrick Leahy, and John Roberts serving as President, Speaker of the House, Senate President Pro Tem, and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, respectively. Funnily enough, of the last 8 Speakers of the House, 6 have been Catholics. Aside from the occasional dumb nonsense from evangelicals or dirtbag atheists, the kind of anti-Catholicism that Irish and other Catholic immigrants experienced during the earlier chapters of American history is largely a thing of the past. It's certainly a far cry from "No Irish Need Apply."
Boys and girls together, me and me.